Welcome back to Unearth the Past, a brand new family history and genealogy podcast brought to you by me, Dr. Michala Hume. This week, folks, we are joined by genealogy royalty. That is right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Ancestrys Crista Cowan, also known as the Barefoot Genealogist. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I feel like I've made it now. I feel like I don't know where I go from here. I feel like I've made it.
Well, thank you for having me, Michala. You have been way kind. I think that's the greatest introduction I've ever received.
Thank you. Well, just to let you know, I follow you on everything. I love all your videos. I watch them on YouTube. You are a real inspiration for genealogists, especially like me, you know, doing genealogy. If I get stuck, I think, what would Crista do? Yeah, what would Crista do? So if we are starting out doing our family tree and we've spoke to our relatives, so we know a tiny bit about it, and we've just logged on to Ancestry, what do we do? Where do we go?
Now, the great thing about building a tree on Ancestry is that it is free. So you don't have to jump right into a subscription. And in fact, I encourage people not to. If you've taken a DNA test or if you set up a free registered guest account, you can start building that tree and take the time to do it before you ever pay any subscription monies to access those historical record collections available on the site.
Now, I love your tree building, the tree building side of Ancestry's website. I have all my trees that I'm building or that I've built over the years on that website. Honestly, it's that big. I've got that many trees on there now. I'm waiting for an email to say you need to clear some off. I really like the fact it's so easy to build the tree and the fact you can link records that you are looking at directly to that tree and you start to build the family history of a person. Is that what we should be using it for, Crista?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not just building it. Sometimes building a tree sounds a little bit stuffy to some people, probably not to your listeners, but it's not just about tree building, really. It's also about making sure that we capture those memories, uploading photographs, talking to our family and getting stories that they may have, right? Like I have been doing family history since I was a kid, and I still hear new stories all the time when I start talking to my family. I'll share a story if that's okay.
Please do.
So my grandfather, my mom's dad, passed away when she was 17. And so my whole life I've heard stories about him. And one of the stories that we've been told is that he never knew when his birthday was. It was either the 2nd of October or the 4th of October. And it was in either 1920 or 1921. And part of the reason we didn't know was because he was born at home and a country doctor came around and, days after the birth and said, when was the baby born? And somebody said, oh, I think it was last Tuesday. And so he just wrote down a date in his book. And then the reason he didn't know what year he was born was because when he was younger, his mom died when he was 3. And so he was raised by a wicked stepmother, who my uncles used to say is the reason stepmothers are called wicked. She was pretty horrible. And she lied about his age so that she could keep taking the money that he earned for an extra year. And so that was the story that I was raised with my whole life. Last week on Ancestry, I discovered that we have published the Arkansas birth records. And there is an actual birth certificate for my grandfather. And it lists his date of birth as the 4th of October, 1921. And so now we have definitive proof of his birth date. But the weird thing was, on his birth certificate, his name is spelled differently than he spelled it his whole life. So, of course, I immediately call my mother, who has told me this story my whole life, And I share this with her, and she says, oh, yeah, that's funny. I think I remember my dad saying something about, and then out comes this whole new story that I had never heard before. And this certificate had just tweaked her memory a little bit about something that she hadn't thought of in, 50 or 60 years since he passed. And so there's always new things to discover. And sometimes it's the records that spur those discoveries. And sometimes it's just the conversations.
Ancestry has a lot of records, doesn't it, on the site?
Yeah, 40 billion of them.
There you go. 40 billion, folks. Billion. From all over the world. I have found my ancestors who moved to America with, well, it was Stan Laurel, who then became Laurel and Hardy.
Mm-hmm.
I found his records on there, and also the records of his wife, who was American. I have found records for my Polish great grandmother. Who'd have thought I'd have been able, sitting in my living room in rainy old Cheshire, I would be able to find records from the late Victorian period of my Polish ancestors from my living room. So if you want records and you have ancestors, not just from the UK, but from most of the world, honestly, check out Ancestry, because their record collection is the biggest that I have come across in my research.
Yeah, we have 40 billion records from 80 countries around the world. And last year we added 5 billion records to the site. And this year we're tracking to add an additional 15 billion records. So the rate of growth is not only not slowing down, it's exponentially getting faster because of the new technologies that we have. One of the features on Ancestry that I love is the little leaf hint, because basically as soon as you enter something in your tree, Ancestry goes to work for you trying to find, do we have anything in those 40 billion records that looks like it might be for the same person. Now, of course, people have similar names. And, my dad has what I thought was a super unique name, but there are two men who grew up within a 5-mile radius of him who have the same name and are only a year or so different in age. So you have to kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're looking at those hints. But you'll get hints for things like census records, birth, marriage, and death records, passenger lists, military service records. All of those will start popping up in your tree, and then you just carefully review them one at a time, and we will tell you exactly what's on the record. If we have an image to the record, you can view that original document, and then full source citations are going to show up if you decide to accept that into your tree so that you've got a really well documented trail that you're climbing your tree and not somebody else's tree.
And am I right by saying as well that you can connect your DNA, can't you, to your family tree? So if you've done a DNA test, you can connect that as well.
Yes, Ancestry does have a DNA service, so Ancestry DNA. And if you take the DNA test with Ancestry, you can connect it to the tree that you have on Ancestry. And there's a couple of things that does. One is it allows our algorithms to look at all those DNA matches that you get. And if you've got a tree and your match has a tree, we can provide you with a suggested path for who your common ancestor might be. And that could be a great-grandparent, or it could be a 5 times great-grandparent. And we can kind of put together a path for that relationship for you to investigate further.
How have you found the whole DNA thing? I follow you on social media, and I think it was it a few weeks ago? It seemed like the middle of the night where you were, and you said you just solved a DNA puzzle. How have you found it? Has it enhanced your research, Crista?
Not only has it enhanced my research experience, it's also accelerated the rate at which I make discoveries. DNA was, Ancestry released it back in March of 2012. And so we're a decade into this, and I continue to make new discoveries as new people test and they're matched to myself or to my parents or my grandmother who all have tested. then that becomes this mystery or this puzzle to solve. I love the word that you used there. This thing that I just have to figure out. Who is this new second or third or fourth cousin, and how do they fit into the family tree? And then once I've solved that, as thrilling as that is, hopefully that becomes a new connection or a new relationship to pursue. Because one of the things that often happens in families is, 3 times great grandma had 12 kids, and only one of those children oftentimes inherited all the photographs and the stories and the information, the family Bible and whatever else, right? And so you have to sometimes track down other branches of the family tree to find some of those additional rich details about those common ancestors that you share. DNA is a great way to do that.
Now, we've already mentioned that there are billions of records on Ancestry. Do you have any favourite records, or could you maybe throw out 5 record sets that you think it's worth us checking out on Ancestry?
Yeah, of course. So as a genealogist, the foundational record set I think that most of us use is the census. And luckily, you and I, Michala, both come from countries where that is prevalent, right? In England, they take a census every 10 years on the ones. In the US, they take a census every 10 years on the zeros. They also take a census every 10 years in Canada. And then the governments in all 3 countries have different rules regarding whether those records are public or private for how long. And really, they're the only 3 countries in the world that consistently take a census and have made it publicly available. So Australia, for example, they take a census every 10 years, but their national laws are such that they tabulate all that data and then they destroy the census. So it's not publicly available ever for genealogy. So we're really fortunate if we come from one of those 3 countries that we have that foundational record set available, because it gives us a snapshot every 10 years of what the structure of that family was, who was living there, how old they were, what they were doing for work. And sometimes you get extra little bonus details thrown in. The 1931 census for Canada was just released the 1st of June, so it's only been out for a few weeks. And one of the questions that the government asked on that census was, does this household own a radio? Which seems like an odd question until you realize that they were trying to implement a national emergency broadcasting system, and they needed to know who would even be able to hear that or to get that, to receive that message. And so that's the question the government asked for their purposes. But genealogically, that gives us an insight into how much money they may have had, or how they viewed advancing technologies, and whether they were, up on the latest things, or whether they were kind of followers in that way. And so those censuses, that's for me the best record available for sure. You wanted 4 more? I can keep going.
That's funny. Our listeners will be loving this.
So the next step is always for me birth, marriage, and death records. And just having access to some of that basic information helps us fill in the blanks on a family tree. It doesn't help us fill in the blanks in a story, though. And so the third, probably most important record set for me is going to be newspapers. Anywhere I can find a newspaper, it's going to give me some insight, some story, some scandal, some everyday snippet of information that's going to help me understand these people better and their lives a little bit better. And I know you have a particular fondness for newspapers as well.
I love a newspaper. I've literally written 2 books based off articles that I found in newspapers, Crista. I love them. Can I just ask, just going back slightly, you know what you were saying about like birth, marriage, and death records? What is the difference, have you found, between the information, say, we'd get on an American record and the information, say, we'd get on a British record? Is there a big difference? And like, obviously over here in England, when we want to order, say, birth certificate, we go to the GRO, it costs us 11 quid. It seems like it takes months for them to send it out. Honestly, I don't know what they send it by. Mine was apparently posted yesterday. If I get it this week, I'll be shocked, right? But in terms of information, what is the difference? Like, do we get anything different on, say, an American record than what we get over here, or Canadian?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, couple of differences. One is England, of course, started keeping birth, marriage, and death records back in 1837, which I think is brilliant and lovely. And they're countrywide records, and it's so orderly, and I appreciate it so much. um, Ancestry has the indexes to all of those GRO records, which is great because you can get a hint or you can do a search and find if a record exists. Now, of course, the challenge is um, y'all tend to use very common names, and so I might get 5 or 6 people with the exact same name, born in with their birth registered in the same quarter, and at 11 quid a pop, I have to order sometimes 2 or 3 different certificates to figure out which one is my person. But the consistency and the nationwide coverage in England is so much better. Here in the US, all of the birth, marriage, and death records are regulated at a state level. Okay. So the first problem is you have to know what state they were born in. Just the US is not sufficient because there's no countrywide coverage of that. The second challenge is that every state then controls when they started keeping records, and that's different for every state. And then they also control the privacy level of those records. So in England, the GRO index is public all the way through today, but in the US, it varies by state. So here in Utah, where I was born, there's a 100-year privacy on birth records. But in California, where my siblings and my parents were all born, there is no privacy law. It's very similar to England, where the indexes are freely available. And so you have to understand all the different places. The last thing I would say about that is just that in England, oftentimes when we get that register entry from the GRO, it has very limited information as opposed to a birth certificate here in the US. The one I just looked at for my grandfather last week from Arkansas listed the names and ages and occupations and addresses of both of his parents. Wow. It listed the name of the doctor who showed up to record the birth. It listed the address where they had lived. It listed how many children had been born to that mother. So we knew he was, number 6. It listed, I'm trying to think of what else was on there. The residence of the parents, the place where the baby was born. I mean, they're just often have a lot more information. Yeah.
You can see on some sites the mother's maiden name. But to get that information, you have to order it, as I've said, and then it takes a bit of time to come. And then you kind of feel a bit shortchanged because you're not really going to do anything with it other than just look at the information. But, it is what it is. And as I moaned on, I think, last week's podcast, there isn't really a lot we can do about that. Picking up back with your favourite records, it's funny that you actually mentioned newspapers, because when I was looking for my ancestor, who I've already mentioned, moved to California, he was an actor, to find out what happened to him, which then led me on to more records I found in the newspaper. So I found that in 1933, he'd stopped being in silent films with Laurel and Hardy. He was now a makeup artist. I think he was working for Warner Brothers at the time, and he had a heart attack. And that's sadly how he died. But I wouldn't have known that had I not found that in the American newspapers. So I, as you well know, I love a newspaper. Have you used newspapers a lot in your research?
Yeah, so much. So Ancestry actually has a sister site called newspapers.com. And if you have the top level Ancestry subscription, it's called All Access. You do get access to those. We have English titles as well as Canadian titles, and of course, a very large collection of US newspaper titles that go back in some cases to the 1700s, which is brilliant. The further back you get in your research to have that resource. I have found that newspapers I like to call them the Facebook of their day, right? Like sometimes in some of these small newspapers, you had editors who were just trying to fill column inches. And so they'll have like a little society column and they'll just get little like 1 or 2 sentence snippets of what's happening around town. And I have broken through more brick walls with some of those little society snippets. For example, I had looked forever for this woman's maiden name and I couldn't find it and I couldn't find it. And it wasn't showing up on any records that I had access to. And there was this little 2-line thing in a newspaper that just said something to the effect of Mrs. John Smith just returned from Omaha where she was visiting her daughter, Mrs. William Johnson, who just had a baby. Well, it was William Johnson's wife's maiden name that I was looking for. And now knowing that her mother had come visit, now I could go and dig into that information to verify that as her maiden name. And it was just from a little snippet in a newspaper. So I love the big dramatic, juicy articles. Of course, I have an ancestor who's a bigamist who made all the headlines, but I also love those little society snippets.
I've been chasing a bigamist, Crista, honestly, for about 5 years. Yeah, I've been everywhere with him. I started off in Ireland, then I went to Italy, then I went to London, then I went all over England because he went on a bit of a tour. And I'm on about wife number 5 in Ireland. He's just left her now. He's on his way back over to London. I do know kind of how it ends because we covered it I did a podcast with Brad called Behind the Headlines of History. It's an Ancestry podcast. It's still out there. I'm sure it is. If you want to have a little Google search, I'm sure you can find it. And I spoke about him with Brad on that podcast. And I've been obsessed with him ever since. And I know how the story ends. I know that in 1864, he ends up in prison for the final time for his bigamy. And also he stole money off these women as well. So I know he goes to prison. I do not know what happens to him after that. So I think it's probably going to be another decade of researching before I can answer the question. I need more records to be released. But I'm presuming he probably just changed his name and got on a boat and may have ended up in America, changed his identity and just left the country. So we've mentioned newspapers, we've mentioned census records and birth, marriage and death records. Are there any other records that you enjoy reading or that have really helped you with your research?
Yeah, I think I'd say my 4th favorite record set is military records of all variations, but in particular pension files. I love service records and enlistment records because they kind of give you a timeline and you understand a little bit more about that. But those pension files, when the pensioner is applying to the government, they have to often prove who their spouse is and who their children are. Or if the widow is the one applying, she'll have to provide affidavits about her relationship with her husband and that she was still happily married to him and hasn't married somebody else. And so sometimes you get just basic forms that have been filled out, but sometimes you get, like just meaty files full of letters and pages of family Bibles and, letters from other relatives who are acclaiming that this person really is who they say they are and that they really were in this relationship. And it helps solve genealogy problems, but it also gives this really unique insight into the bureaucracy of the day when so many of these men in most cases had served their country and then they have to come begging, or their widows have to come begging for a pension just to survive the last part of their lives. And it's just a really interesting file. Here in the US in particular, we have those pension files dating all the way back to I guess here we call it the Revolutionary War. There you call it something a little different. but we have those then through the War of 1812, through the Civil War. And then in the UK, of course, we see some of those records as well, which are just brilliant.
So we've mentioned military records. Last last one, I'm not very good at counting, but I think the last one would be number 5. Yeah.
Yeah, number 5. My probably the 5th set of records I use the most are immigration records. Records, inbound, outbound passenger lists. Of course, England is fantastic because not only did y'all keep track of who came in for a period of time, you kept track of who was leaving as well. And then, just kind of the ancillary records around that, not just passenger lists, but citizenship records, passports, like all of those different kinds of records that talk about the movement of people. And sometimes it's permanent movement, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just trips back and forth across the pond. Oftentimes we find people were much more mobile than we give them credit for. I think we think, oh, somebody got on a ship and never came home. No, like I have a Scottish 3 times great grandfather left Edinburgh in 1830 to go to Canada, thought he was leaving forever. But in 1839, he had the opportunity to go home for about 6 or 8 months and took it. And then we see him on another ship coming back to the US in late 1839. And this time, he left from New York to go to Liverpool, and then, made his way up to Scotland to visit his family. And then he sailed out of Liverpool and ended up coming back into the US through New Orleans. And
Right.
He was actually on one of those first ships that came to New Orleans and then transported passengers from a ocean vessel to a river ship and went up the Mississippi River with a group of about, 40 or 50 people that had immigrated with him from Scotland and England. So people sometimes went back and forth. And so don't just stop at that one passenger list that you find them on. You might be surprised to find them later. And then as time progresses, right? So in the 1830s and 40s, a passenger list might have really scant information on it. But as time passes, those forms become more robust. And when you hit the turn of the century, now you've got information about sometimes who they're coming to in the country that they're visiting, who they left behind, who their nearest relative is in the country they just left, how much money they have in their pocket, how tall they are, what color their hair and eyes are. Like you get, like those forms just get more and more and more detailed, so that you start to get a really clear picture of who these people were.
What motivated you at the beginning then to start looking into your family history? Like, where did this all start for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I was raised in a family that family history was really important, but the origin story that I tell goes a little something like this. My parents were both born and raised in Los Angeles, and when they got married, they decided they wanted to fly the nest and go to school somewhere else. And so they came to Utah for college, and I was born while they were going to school here. And so you've got these 2 young newlyweds with 2 different degrees in college that they're pursuing and a new baby. And basically that meant they spent no time together. And for my mom, that was not acceptable. So she told my dad that for their last 2 years of school, they were going to take a class together every semester. And at Brigham Young University, where they went to school, there you can actually pursue a degree in family history. So they have a lot of family history classes. And so even though my dad was an accounting major and my mom was an English major, what they chose to do was to take a family history class together every semester. But because they were both in the same class, they had to bring the baby with them. So I was with them in those classes. And then one Friday a month, they would drive up to Salt Lake City to the old family history library and shove me and my baby carrier under a microfilm reader, and just tell me the stories that they were finding as they sat there doing research all day. Of course, they now take full credit for my career since that was the genesis of that.
And so they
But,
should. Yeah, I'm surprised they don't want a bit of commission.
right?
Yeah.
So that was kind of their start in family history. And then, of course, being raised in a home with that as kind of a focus, having family pictures on the wall. We always had a family tree on the wall. So I think just even having those things in my environment, had we never spoken about it, would have had an effect and an impact on me. And then I was just raised knowing, I know all 4 of my grandparents. Even though one died before I was born, I was hearing constant stories about him, going to family reunions, meeting my cousins. I know all 12 of my first cousins. I know, most of my dad's first cousins and my mom's first cousins and their kids and now grandkids. And so we're just a family who's always been very involved in one another's lives. And when I started meeting people when I was in college who didn't have that, some people who couldn't even name all four of their grandparents, it was so baffling to me that I just had this innate desire to want to share that with everyone. And so family history became this place where not only could I help facilitate those discoveries for other, but in the role that I specifically serve at Ancestry, I can educate people to help them make those discoveries for themselves. And there's just something so fulfilling about seeing somebody's face light up for the first time when they see their grandpa on a census record and realize, oh my gosh, those are his parents and his brothers and sisters. And I had no idea these people even existed, and yet they were such an important part of my grandfather's life. I love that moment.
Obviously, this isn't my day job for me. So I'm a lecturer in history during the day, but I've been doing this now for 20 odd years. And I regularly spend my spare time helping people who don't know who their birth parents are. And I do that for free. Never charge anyone. I do it for free. And that's just me giving back because I have those skills. I've acquired them over a long period of time. DNA now helps and makes the process a lot quicker. But that is just me giving back. I also believe that nobody should be buried alone. So over here, we get coroners reaching out for family members of people that have passed away. And you think, if there's more people out there that can do this, and it does cost money to research your family tree if you have to buy certificates, as they're not cheap. However, if you've got your local library card, as I always say, first stop your local library, because often they have some subscriptions to genealogical websites. And if you've got a library card, you can research for free. And there are people there to help from local family history societies. So check that out. But I always think that, if people are watching us on YouTube or they're listening to us on Apple, I started with very little information. I know you had more information than me, but it is addictive, isn't it? And it's something that, it's such an enjoyable hobby, and we are very lucky that we have made careers out of it to a point. But anybody can do it, can't they, Crista? Anybody can do this.
Yeah, it's interesting. All families are messy, and families have always been messy. But one of the things that I find in family history is that when we start asking questions, sometimes just the process of asking those questions starts to heal some of those messy relationships. One of the things I get to do here at Ancestry every 2 weeks, as we have new employees starting, groups of a few people, I get to sit down with them for 2 hours, an hour their first day, an hour their second day, and help them start their family tree.
Wow.
And one of the homework assignments I give them on day one is think about somebody in your family who knows more about your family history than you do and call them tonight. And just the act of making that phone call, of reaching out to that grandparent or that uncle, or in some cases, even a parent. I've seen some really incredible things happen over the years with these employees who just having that conversation, right? Dad was just waiting for you to ask the question, and now he's going to share all the things with you. And it's a really beautiful thing. So yes, anybody can do it. Sometimes it takes just a moment of bravery to make that phone call or send that text message to a family member you might not have spoken to in a while. But family history has the power to heal some of those relationships. And if nothing else, to put things into perspective as you start to learn more about who those people were and how the choices that they made led to where you are today.
Have you got any advice for people out there who have been researching and they've hit a brick wall? Could you offer any advice, Crista, to where to go, where to look, what to do when you hit a brick wall and you think, well, that's it, can't go any further now?
Yeah, it's interesting because I often deal with this at genealogy conferences. I'll attend an event and somebody will come up to me just with desperation in their eyes. I've been working on this brick wall for 20 years and somehow they expect me to solve it magically in a 5-minute phone, face-to-face conversation. And the reality is that sometimes people are looking for a magic record that's going to answer their question. And the further back in time you get, the less likely that is to happen. So this is going to sound a little bit academic, but I promise I'll bring it back around. In genealogy, we talk about direct evidence and indirect evidence. And direct evidence is the record that states the name of the mother with her maiden name listed there, right? That directly answers the question you're trying to solve. Indirect evidence means sometimes you have to take 10 or 20 different pieces of information and kind of piece the story together. And so, for example, you may not have a birth record that lists the mother's full name, including her maiden name, but you may have a census that lists a nephew that has a surname, and you trace that nephew and you find out that he's the son of this woman, and you find her maiden name, and then you find some other record that lists that, this woman had a sister with that first name, and you string all those little pieces of things together to say, oh, I think based on this indirect evidence that her maiden name was this. And I think sometimes, particularly when we've gone through building our family trees and just really easily accessing direct evidence that answers those questions, we don't ever develop that skill of stringing together that indirect evidence. And it is a skill and it takes practice. And so sometimes, instead of trying to directly barrel your way through that brick wall looking for that direct evidence, maybe try climbing over the wall instead by piecing together lots of different information, and think about researching or looking into the lives of all the people surrounding that person, because very often the clue that you need or the little piece of indirect evidence you need will be because of a sibling or because of a grandchild or somebody else in their life.
What I will say as well, and I know we spoke about this earlier on, is we mentioned that on Ancestry you get like the leaf, and also you get matches to other people's family trees.
Yep.
What I will say, and I know you'll probably echo this, is if you do end up being matched to somebody else's family tree, make sure that they have done the research correctly before you go ahead and then add it all and realize that actually they've gone wrong and then you've gone wrong. That was like a rookie error that I think I made quite a bit at the beginning. I think I thought, yeah, they obviously know more than me. They must be right, and then sometimes they're not. Would you echo that?
Absolutely, Michala. Yeah. And you are not alone. I have made that same mistake myself over the years. I, for a very long time, thought I was a descendant of a Mayflower passenger, only in my more experienced years to come back and review it and realize I had copied some information somewhere along the line and assumed that these were the parents of this person. And when I had to disconnect that branch and break it off, it was painful. but yeah, that's kind of how that works. Yeah, we just have to be really careful about what we're copying. There's a phrase. I started my YouTube series, The Barefoot Genealogist, back in 2011, and have been doing it pretty consistently since then. And I always sign those shows off, have fun climbing your family tree. And a lot of people for a long time thought I was emphasizing the word fun, because it is fun. But now I tend to emphasize the word your family tree. Have fun climbing your family tree a little bit more, because it is really easy to just take a wrong turn and then discover later you've been climbing someone else's family tree, not your own.
I am nearly going to let you go, but I just want to ask you one question that's about 14 questions wrapped up in one.
Okay.
If you could invite anybody from your family tree for dinner tonight, who would that be? What would you cook? And is there anything you would like to ask them?
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic question. So I do have lots of favorite ancestors, but one that I've been particularly obsessed with, she's actually the previous wife of the Bigamist. Her name was Carrie Inman. She is my great-great-grandmother. She was born in Ohio and at the beginning of the U.S. Civil War and orphaned at a young age. Her father died in the war. Her mother died shortly thereafter of an illness. She was raised by her maternal grandparents, but they were quite elderly and sickly. And so she pretty much fended for herself her whole life. And when she got married, she thought that was going to be this great thing. And then he ended up being kind of a cad and left her with 2 boys to raise on her own. And then when her older son, got married and had 4 children of his own, he ended up pulling the same stunt his father did. And so now she's left with this daughter-in-law who was from New Orleans and was Cajun. And here in the U.S., it's a very different culture in different parts of the country. And she has these 4 girls and she's stuck in Ohio. And so Carrie told her daughter-in-law, if you want to go home to your family and raise your girls there near them, I'll go with you. And so she picked up her whole life and moved to New Orleans and spent the rest of her life taking care of those 4 little girls and helping to raise them and then some of their children as they started to come along. That woman is my grandfather's grandmother, and he only met her twice in his whole life because she was so busy in New Orleans working and helping to raise these cousins of his. And he lost touch with them. She died while he was serving in World War II. And we had very little information about her and about her life. And he asked me to find his cousins. And unfortunately, I didn't find them until after he passed, but I did find them. I have been to New Orleans a few times to visit them. I'm actually leaving tomorrow to go spend a week down there. And so I don't get to have dinner with her, but if I could, I would. I do get to have dinner with these cousins, though. And the oldest one remembers her and knew her and was, helped raised by her for the first 6 or 8 years of her life. And to be able to hear those stories and get that information is just so precious to me after looking for her for so long. She was my brick wall. And to be able to find a way around that and through that was a 30-year quest of my life. And so I would have a dinner with her. I would want to ask her about whether she understood the sacrifice that she was making and whether she really felt like she had a choice and did that voluntarily and sacrificially, or whether she felt like she had no choice. And then what would I fix for her? Oh, that's a good question. I would probably just make a comfort meal, right? Like meatloaf and mashed potatoes and, something that for me always just feels like I'm taking care of the little girl that I was, because I feel like maybe she wasn't as taken care of for most of her life as she could have been.
In terms of your family tree, is there anything left for you to find, Crista, or do you feel like now you've gone as far as the records will take you? Or is there any part of your tree still left?
No, there's so much still to find. I actually have another brick wall on my mom's side of the family tree. Her great-grandfather was an immigrant and maybe from Ireland, but we're not sure. So his name was John O'Brien. We just don't know whether he was born there or here. And that's what we're trying to solve.
Crista Cowan, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Honestly, I am such a fan. So thank you so much for taking the time to jump on and chat to me.
Thanks for having me. It was delightful.
I really hope you enjoyed my chat with Ancestry's Crista Cowan, otherwise known as the Barefoot Genealogist. Thank you so much for listening. I've been amazed by the amount of people that are listening to this podcast. So thank you so much, and I hope you are enjoying it. If you have any questions or you want to contact me, you can do so via my website, www.michalahume.com. Have a fabulous week researching, and I shall see you again next Monday.